B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, January 29th, 2020. Monday is the Iowa caucuses, just a few days away. And with Bernie Sanders ready to clean up there and also in New Hampshire. The corporate Democrats, the Clinton wing, the supporters of Joe Biden, they're shaking in their boots. And I think this is just the way Bernie hoped it would play out. He is gaining strength in key demographic voter groups right at the critical time. And in a moment, I will share with you some of the attacks on Bernie. There's an AIPAC-aligned super PAC that has dropped $700,000, which is big money in Iowa television, with a hit on Bernie. Jennifer Rubin, Jonathan Chait, reliable attack dogs, have new attack bones that they are throwing out there. And there are other ways that Bernie is being undermined by his opponents of various stripes. What's it all about? Well, at the top of the show file for today's podcast, I have placed a link for 538.com's projections of the state of play in the Democratic primary today. And it is fascinating because not only is Sanders doing well in the early states of Iowa and New Hampshire, but as you go through the primary and caucus calendar that runs all the way to June, Bernie Sanders is in good shape, and he is growing at a point where Elizabeth Warren has already peaked and started to decline, and Joe Biden has peaked and is doing his best to hold on. Now, Biden does have some strength, especially in southern states. I am not writing him out of the picture at this point. But the guy who's on the upswing is Bernie Sanders. And the 538 projection at this point shows at the end of the process that Biden would have about 720 delegates to Sanders' 1,200. Now, I think that Sanders estimate is low, but it takes 1,900 and something to clinch the Democratic nomination. And so Biden falls short of that, and it is coming mostly from the support that is growing for Bernie Sanders. So, for example, in the Iowa caucuses, Sanders is forecasted to win. They show an average 19% when they merge all the different polls. The recent ones show him well over 25%. Sanders is forecast to win an average of 28% of the vote in Iowa. And Pete Buttigieg is showing up in second place with Biden in third, Warren in fourth. And they also take a look at various different calculations of how the delegates are selected and assigned and show their projections for who comes away with the most delegates. Then we look at New Hampshire. Sanders forecast to win an average 29% of the vote. Nevada caucuses, Sanders forecast to win 34% of the vote. South Carolina, Biden expected to win with 40% of the vote, and Sanders is moving up into the mid-20s at this point. And let me look at a few more. California primary coming up on March 3rd. It is Sanders in the lead with a projection of 30% of the vote here, and Biden is in second place. So when I looked through this all the way through the primary calendar, and with the expected losses for Sanders in some of the more moderate and southern conservative states, he shows a really good path forward, and there is a plausible path to the nomination. So when you have a chance, go ahead and log into 538. As I said, I provided the specific link to their primary forecast. And you just look at the graphs, and you can see particularly how Elizabeth Warren has sharply declined at the same moment that Sanders has moved up. And the pivotal date was the Iowa debate, where Elizabeth Warren staged her attacks on Bernie Sanders. So what does this tell us? Well, it means that everybody, his mother and his brother, is ready to move in and see what they can do to drive up the negatives of Bernie Sanders. Now, I've worked on political campaigns as a media consultant, up to and including the level of a U.S. Senate race, and so I know a little bit about this. And much of it is related to just trying to make people dislike your opponent. And this is how it works. So Sanders, I think, is well prepared for this assault. And I think that he is solid with his supporters. And that is that he doesn't have that many people who are on the fence. Now, he is the second choice of many candidates who will not clear the 15% margin in order to qualify for a caucus endorsement coming up Monday night in Iowa. Now, as I mentioned, there is a Democratic super PAC aligned with the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC. It's called the Democratic Majority for Israel, and it is run by a Democratic pollster named Mark Mellman. And it's interesting because, his aim is to support Israel and to keep the Democratic Party in the camp of the pro-Zionist movement, both in the United States and worldwide. But what's interesting here is because he's a pollster, he decided not to attack directly on Bernie's even-handed stand about Israel and Palestine. Let's listen.
The most important thing is we have to beat Trump.
We've seen the damage that Trump and the Republican Congress have done.
I doubt if Bernie Sanders can beat Trump.
I like Bernie. I think he has great ideas. But Michigan, Pennsylvania, Iowa, they're just not going to vote for a socialist.
I do have some concerns about Bernie Sanders' health, considering the fact that he did have a heart attack.
I think it's very important that the Democrats nominate somebody that can beat Trump.
I don't feel as though Bernie Sanders would do well against Donald Trump.
I just don't think Bernie can beat Trump.
DMFI PAC is responsible for the content of this advertising.
So these are Democrats attacking Democrats, and in many ways you can see that this is just an amalgam of the poll-tested arguments that moderates use against Bernie Sanders. So over at the Washington Post, I believe Jennifer Rubin has a quota of 3 anti-Sanders pieces a week. Here is one of the 2 that I've seen so far. And she writes by quoting Pete Buttigieg, or at least referencing him, saying that he consistently demonstrates a mature understanding of how one unites a party and builds a winning general election coalition. But Sanders, she says, seems clueless. Now, this is the guy who built an incredible movement in 2016, coming out of nowhere, shocking the pants off Hillary Clinton and her supporters. And he doesn't know how to unite or build a coalition? Her headline betrays her bias. Bernie Sanders' Trump-like campaign is a disaster for Democrats. How about a quote? The polar opposite of this is Sanders and his fleet of Bernie bros who slash and burn, attack and smear other Democrats. The New York Times reports on Sanders' swarm of online supporters who've waged vicious and personal attacks on his critics, often focusing on feminist women. Now, there's no mention that many of these women attacked Bernie Sanders supporters in their outsized support for Hillary Clinton in 2016. No, it's always the Bernie bros who are the attackers and the Hillary sisters who are the victims. Then she quotes the New York Times. Some progressive activists who declined to back Sanders have begun traveling with private security after incurring online harassment. Several well-known feminist writers said they had received death threats. So this is how she compares Bernie to Trump. Never mind that none of these alleged threats have been known to actually come to life. But Trump's supporters have shot up a synagogue. There's Cesar Sayoc in Florida who mailed the bomb packages to all Democratic leaders. But, of course, we don't include that. Then she takes a swipe at David Sirota. Sanders hired one of social media's most aggressive trolls, David Sirota. Sanders cannot possibly mean to control the divisive rhetoric and animosity spewing from his camp while hiring people infamous for such conduct. Well, David Sirota is a good, aggressive wordsmith. I've been on his Facebook feed for a long time. He's not active now because he's in the campaign. But I always thought his posts were thoughtful, and I never found him to be a troll like, David Brock, Hillary's online aggressive fighter. Then she goes on, Sanders' denials often strike one as implausible. This refers to the talking points document that was given to volunteers where they showed the difference between Warren voters and Sanders voters. And this is described as a detailed script attacking Warren surfaced and was circulated in multiple states. So this is such sheer exaggeration. And what is the purpose? To bring down Sanders and to promote Joe Biden. Then we turn to reporting colleagues of Jennifer Rubin's at the Washington Post. She's on the opinion page. Matt Visor and Annie Linsky write, top Democrats are increasingly alarmed that Sanders could gain unstoppable momentum from the primary voting that starts next week. But they also fear that any anti-Sanders effort would backfire, and that has sidelined any significant Stop Sanders effort for now. Well, they're right about that, because the attacks by Warren solidified Sanders' base and weakened support for the senator from Massachusetts. Even the hint of an organized anti-Sanders movement would risk alienating the Vermont senator's sometimes belligerent supporters and play into claims that the process is rigged, many Democrats say privately. Matt Bennett, vice president of Third Way, a centrist Democratic group. People need to start taking Bernie pretty seriously. There's a really substantial risk of him becoming unstoppable if he wins these early states by large numbers. Can you hear that? A Democrat wants a fellow Democrat not to become unstoppable. Now, the reference there isn't to defeating Trump, but that's what I would insert there. But he went on, despite some discussions among people wringing their hands, it's not like our phone is ringing from people saying, let's do something. Nevertheless, they blasted out an email to Iowa Democrats saying that Sanders has a politically toxic background, his far-left positions will repel swing voters, when the opposite is truth. It is true that Sanders brings in swing voters and people who identify as independents, and even some Republicans who won't vote for Trump or won't vote for him again. Then they try to float that he's never faced tough scrutiny. He's a largely untested candidate. I mean, that's just such bullshit. And so you heard the voice in the commercial there. The Washington Post quotes the voice in the commercial. And I produced enough of those commercials to tell you that those are highly scripted. The average Joes and Joannes who appear in there are reading a cardboard. You know, in a campaign, you don't bother with a teleprompter. You put it up on a nice big piece of cardboard. And then they recite it into camera 50 times, and you pick the one where they looked and sounded the best. So this onslaught continues. Jonathan Chait, just Google Jonathan Chait. His last name is spelled C-H-A-I-T. He writes for New York Magazine. He has been attacking Sanders, all the way back to 2015, 2016. And in his latest piece, which is like a greatest hits of all his slams on Sanders, he said that running Sanders against Trump would be an act of insanity. And over at Jacobin, Eric Blank, who is described as a Bay Area former teacher, just takes it apart. He says, although the Vermont senator has a proven record of defeating Republicans, receives the highest polling numbers among independents, and has already won 12 electoral races, Chait nevertheless would have us believe that Sanders is somehow virtually unelectable in 2020. And he tweaks Chait by citing his piece from 2016, headlined, Why Liberals Should Support a Trump-Republican Nomination. So then there's a lengthy comparison of the midterms in 2018 with the likely turnout of voters in 2020. But there is an important point that the Pelosi majority in the House of Representatives is populated by moderate Democrats, some of whom were Republicans before they were recruited to run. And that among the nearly 40 House districts won in 2018, about 30 are rated prosperous. So these are well-heeled suburban voters, and that applies to Orange County, here in California, where they flipped a bunch of red districts blue for the first time in, a blue moon. So, good piece there. I recommend it. Then we turn to Ryan Grimm, who is at The Intercept, and he notes that the back and forth, the debate between Biden and Sanders over the issues of Social Security are benefiting Bernie Sanders. And the reason is boomers like me are shifting away from the Joe Biden they thought was well-positioned to beat Trump, recognizing that Sanders is a much more aggressive campaigner who will bring a lot more excitement and less baggage to the campaign. For example, a new poll of Iowa caucus goers found a 17-point swing away from Biden and toward Sanders in the 45 to 64 age group. Another survey from Emerson found an 11-point swing among voters over 50. Here in California, Biden is flat among the 65 and up demographic, but Sanders gained 8 points since December. Biden still leads. I want to be clear about that, but it is Sanders who is growing. And that's what you look for in a campaign. Will the momentum build? So when I see these baby boomers recognizing that Sanders can win and shifting their support, that's when I say to my fellow baby boomers, okay, boomers, trying to reappropriate that little epithet against boomers when it's launched by millennials. Now, the Trump campaign is analyzing the situation. We've seen that Trump's tweets about Sanders have sharply increased. Some of them act as if Bernie is a victim, and he is, of the Democratic National Committee, and the act is that somehow Trump is sympathetic, doesn't want to see Bernie get screwed again. But some of Trump's advisors believe that Sanders is beatable in a general election and have worked to elevate him, thinking the way Hillary did, that Trump could not possibly win, and you get to pick the guy you think you can beat. But the same article suggested that Trump himself disagrees, has been working to undermine Sanders with his public comments. One supporter of Trump said the president has been in need of a clear target for months, and he believes he's actually hurting Sanders. Trump's advisors do not necessarily agree on that. And yesterday I cited a piece, I think it was from the Washington Post, where they said they went to a Democratic dinner in Iowa and interviewed 30 undecided voters, and they were all never Bernie people. Well, the flip side comes from BuzzFeed today, and they quote a dozen people who are committed to other candidates, and they all say that if Bernie's the nominee, they're going to vote for him. Here's 71-year-old Ms. Sandy Stanley. I would vote for my dead cat over Trump. I think Bernie's too divisive. I'm afraid he wouldn't win over a lot of independents and moderate Republicans, so I'm hoping he doesn't get it. But Trump, anyone but Trump. She's leaning to Klobuchar or Warren. More than 24 voters at 6 Biden campaign events said that they are committed to supporting Biden now, but they would support Sanders if he is the nominee. And I won't read you all, well, one more quote, all right. I've supported Joe Biden for decades. I've always been real comfortable with him. I'll vote for any Democrat in the general election. I'm not a Bernie fan, but yes, I'll support him. 67-year-old Dick Huber. I would vote for him, begrudgingly. And this is a very interesting proposition. As a longtime lefty, I have bristled at being the target of wedge politics. Bill Clinton played it. He figured that liberals like me had nowhere else to go, so he could cut welfare and do all kinds of conservative things, and I'd hold my nose and vote for him. I didn't, but he thought I would. And likewise, we were wedged into supporting a weak candidate like John Kerry, and we've been wedged in on many issues, and so it's a little delicious payback to see a situation where the moderate, conservative, corporate Democrats are facing a wedging of their own, and they are being wedged to the left. I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime. Yesterday, Joe Biden did it again. He went off on an Iowa voter. This guy is a former state representative named Ed Fallon. And he posed for a picture with Biden, and then he asked him about his position on climate change. And Biden got upset. He said, "You're asking for a picture of me? You come in to tell me that you don't support me and my plan?" Mr. Fallon said, here we go. Biden went on to say, "In the general, I'm running for a primary, a caucus. That's why what I'm running for, okay?" Pointing at the man's chest, and he does that. He gets right in people's faces. So Biden assumed the man was a Sanders supporter, and the guy said, "Well, I'm actually supporting Tom Steyer." So it's testy out there, and Joe is certainly feeling the heat. Now, the Democratic National Committee, in its I won't call it secret, but it wasn't a public process to stack the committees for the convention with all kinds of corporate Democrats, Clinton hangers-on, friends of the DNC chair, Tom Perez. And Kevin Gosztola has a follow-up piece today at Shadowproof. Nearly all of the appointees endorsed Hillary Clinton in 2016. And many were superdelegates who endorsed Hillary all the way back in 2015. Only one high-profile supporter of Bernie Sanders was appointed to the committees, and that's Larry Cohen, who is a former president of CWA, and he founded the pro-Sanders political action organization, Our Revolution. And you can read Gostola's piece. He talks about some of the real just virulent opponents of Sanders who are now stacked on those committees. Now, others will be appointed as the primaries play out, but this is a foundation that is intended to block Bernie Sanders. Over the past few days, we've been reporting how President Trump staged counter-programming to distract people from the impeachment hearings in the Senate, the trial. And, of course, by announcing the presentation of the Crown Prince Jared Middle East peace plan to Benjamin Netanyahu and in a separate meeting to his political opponent Benny Gantz, Trump is trying to claim that despite the efforts to bounce him from his job, that he's just been doing great work and he's brought peace to the Middle East. Well, I want to share with you some important columns. My friend and colleague Joe Lauria, publishing at Consortium News, he writes, "Trump gives away the store, and Israel will now officially become an apartheid state." He recaps all the gifts that Trump has given to Israel with no concessions on their side since he took over in the White House. And if the Israeli cabinet approves Netanyahu's first annexation proposal, Lauria writes, which will include the Jordan Valley, Palestinians living in annexed territories would come under direct Israeli rule, but under the plan would not be allowed to vote in Israeli elections. That is the very definition of apartheid. He goes on to say, while many critics of Israel have pointed out that Israel is already running a de facto apartheid system in its rule over 4 million Palestinians without rights, legal apartheid would come with annexation of the West Bank. And he goes on to quote a number of interesting people, including international law professor and human rights expert Francis Boyle. He said, as this plan moves forward, I don't think there will be much of Palestine to speak of. It will be Greater Israel. Then there will be another Nakba, forcing a lot of Palestinians into Jordan. And he cites Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Any claim that this plan envisions a Palestinian state is just false. The plan allows Israel to control all security matters inside the Palestinian state, in quotes, and thus it's not a state at all. The unilateral annexation of the Jordan River Valley and existing settlements deemed illegal under U.S. and international law will set back the peace process decades. So that's a reality take. And even Tom Friedman, the pro-Israel columnist who's been at the New York Times for way too many years. He asks, is this plan about 2 states for 2 peoples, or is it about one diversion for 2 dirty leaders? It sure feels like the latter, he says. After all, both Trump and Netanyahu are in effect facing job-threatening charges. And he also argues that the only way change will come for the better starts with them. And while I rarely agree with Tom Friedman, he is correct. If the parties to this dispute do not initiate the process, and if both are not at equal footing at the proverbial table, it will never be perceived as any kind of an equitable settlement. And in his closer, Friedman writes, if Bibi says he still wants more than this plan gives him already, as ultranationalists and his coalition argue, then he is openly declaring before the President of the United States that his appetite is for all of the West Bank and that his vision for Israel is that it become a binational apartheid state that will hold 2.5 million Palestinians of the West Bank without full political rights. I never thought I'd see Friedman and Laria in general agreement on a situation like this. And at the New York Times, they note in a news report that while 3 Arab ambassadors attended the ceremony, they were from Oman, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. The Saudis were not represented. No Palestinians attended. And this really is, as Friedman suggested, just a distraction for both Netanyahu and for Trump. And David E. Sanger, who is the heavyweight Washington bureau chief of the New York Times, he weighs in an analytical piece with some similar views. Over at The Guardian, I want to recommend a heartfelt commentary written by Glenn Greenwald and his husband, David Miranda. And as you know, recently Greenwald has been charged in Brazil with criminal activity related to his release of damaging documents and text messages that undermined the so-called car wash investigation and the rise of the Bolsonaro government. And I'm not going to take time to quote too much from this, but I encourage you to read it because it gives you the history of how David Miranda decided to run for first city council in Rio de Janeiro and then for the state legislature, the national legislature. And that move was prompted by the assassination in March of 2018 of his good friend and Rio City Councilwoman, Marielle Franco. So that was the first brutal assault that has led Miranda and Greenwald to live with an armored car with armed security guards on duty at their house the entire time. And there have been numerous threats that occurred both before Greenwald released his reporting and after. And it is a scary situation, and I admire the courage of Greenwald and Miranda. They say they could leave. They could come back to the U.S. any time, but they have chosen to stand and fight, and I certainly respect that. Also at The Guardian, I recommend a piece to you called 1 Year Inside Trump's Monumental Facebook Campaign. And the byline goes to Julia Carey Wong, based here in San Francisco, and she and other reporters dove deep into the database of over 200,000 campaign ads that were used by the Trump campaign in 2019 alone. They freshen up their ads about every 20 minutes. And they use fake polls in order to capture people's email addresses and build their network for future contact. And according to Facebook, 72% of the ads that Trump's campaign ran in 2020 were seen by as many as 158 million people. Those are impressions, and that is the top possible number from that level of circulation. So it's interesting to see. And they also show the kind of ebb and flow of the spending by the Trump campaign that was linked to the whistleblowers' discovery back in September and then the impeachment votes in December. It's an interesting little snapshot inside the Trump campaign. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Paul Karsh, Marvin Rasmussen, Alice Carlson, and I see a new name here, Lamara Williams-Jones. Lamara, welcome. I really appreciate your support, and you set an example for others who can join you right now by clicking over to peterbcollins.com. You click on the menu tab, then you click on Become a Subscriber, and you can set up a PayPal account that works for you. You can also use the U.S. mail. You can send a check or money order, and we don't turn down cash either. The post office box is number 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. The Senate trial of Donald J. Trump, President of the United States, has moved into the question and answer period, and the Jeopardy music is not perfect because Jeopardy is the answer and question TV show, right? Anyway, this is going to be, I think, one of the most boring processes because it doesn't really allow for debate. So the senators submit their questions, the Chief Justice reads them and directs them to the House managers or the Trump defenders, and they are supposed to respond. Now, a lot of them are going to be loaded questions that the senators know they will get a favorable answer to, and others may be gotcha questions aimed at embarrassing people. But in the middle, maybe we will have some reasonable questions from reasonable people that draw compelling answers. Nevertheless, I will be watching this, and if there's anything interesting that comes from it, I will share it with you tomorrow. Now, I also want to mention that I know a number of people who are very concerned that this is a pivotal point. And in the critical vote on Friday, if the Republicans stonewall any further witnesses and evidence, no matter how they're negotiated, no matter who it is going to be a victory for fascism. It is going to be the majority of the Republicans in the Senate denying any real fair process or a transparent trial. And if they are able to block the introduction of any additional witnesses, they will then move to a vote to basically dismiss these charges, acquit the president, and end the trial abruptly as soon as Friday. Now, if the Republicans don't manage to hold on to their majority, the Democrats need 4 votes from Republicans, and they need to hold all the Democrats, which is not 100% certain. Then we would see some sort of negotiations to decide which witnesses, and then there will be, I believe, a pause in the trial. Could be as long as 2 weeks before they reconvene to hear those witnesses. So it's a highly unpredictable process. But I had a long talk with my friend Dave last night. He's a retired radio newsman, lives in Dallas. And I really felt the fear in his voice that if we don't really see a breakthrough here, this will be an end of the independence of the 3 branches of government, the subservience to the executive branch, and a path to authoritarian oligarchy. This GOP cult is ready to take itself over a cliff in order to protect Trump. And they will be taking huge portions of what was our republic over that cliff with them. So we get these mixed messages. Last night, Mitch McConnell was saying, and probably feigning, I'm not sure we got the votes to block witnesses. And as of today, the Republicans claim they think they do have enough votes to hold their caucus together and prevent any kind of an outbreak of fairness in this trial. And so yesterday there was the final truncated arguments from the Republican lawyers for Trump. They didn't really say anything new, and they took so little time that I think it shocked a lot of the senators just how weak their arguments are. But their whole strategy is based on the arrogance of knowing or believing that they have a firm, unstoppable grip on at least 51 members of that Republican caucus, and that they are certain that they can flush this impeachment process, as flawed as it has been, and I've shared my complaints with you, and then just move on. My friend Dave is worried that if Trump calls himself vindicated, innocent, any of those terms, acquitted, that payback will ensue, and he figures that Adam Schiff would probably be the first target, maybe of an investigation from the Justice Department or the Senate Judiciary Committee. We don't know. And so, as we try to figure out whether the dam will be broken, whether the stone wall will crack, here's Cory Gardner, who's up for re-election, a Republican in Colorado. I don't believe we need to hear from an 18th witness. I've approached every aspect of this grave constitutional duty with respect and attention, and have reached this decision after carefully weighing the House managers and defense arguments, blah, blah, blah. He is willing to remain in denial and talk about it with a straight face. Wimpy Mitt Romney from Utah now, he's still playing the game. He shared what kinds of questions he will be submitting today and tomorrow, and he continues to hint that he supports witnesses, and he's waiting for other Republicans to join him out on that catwalk. Republican Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, who proposed a one-for-one witness swap earlier this week, said he's very skeptical any witnesses will change his views. I'm very skeptical that there are any witnesses who could shed any light that could cause me to change my view of what the final outcome of this trial ought to be. Yeah, mainly he's afraid of being trash-tweeted by the guy in the Oval Office. House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Eliot Engel has reported now a conversation that he had with John Bolton back in September after Bolton resigned or was fired from the White House. And Engel invited him to testify before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and he said that during that conversation, quote, Ambassador Bolton suggested to me, unprompted, that the committee look into the recall of Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch. He strongly implied that something improper had occurred around her removal as our top diplomat in Ukraine. As I mentioned, the speculation about the witness vote has shifted, and today the number 3 Senate Republican, Barrasso of Wyoming, said, I've heard enough, I'm ready for a vote on final judgment, and he said he believes that the Republicans have the vote to do that. Votes. Now, the other issue is wobbly Democrats. Yesterday, my very senior Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein had to walk back comments she said that were misinterpreted, that she had intended to vote against removing the president, but the testimony has persuaded her that that is not the appropriate outcome. So she's wobbly. And then you got this cat Doug Jones in Alabama, and I know that he barely holds on to his seat, and Jeff Sessions is running, and Roy Moore is running. It's a mess there, I understand. But Jones is saying that he's hinting that he won't vote to convict and remove on the first charge. He said, but I will tell you that this obstruction charge, the more I see the President of the United States attacking witnesses, the stronger that case gets. Those are weasel words. He's like Susan Collins and Lamar Alexander and Mitt Romney. Want to bring you up to speed on a couple of headlines from around the world. RT is the only outlet I've seen this in, but reports with videotape of chaos on the streets of Paris as the firefighters who are protesting the pension cuts and other issues have been the victims of water cannons used by riot police. Now, this is kind of interesting to me because in French, the term for firefighter is pomper. It's a pumper. And they're on the receiving end of the same kind of equipment that they use professionally. Today at the White House, Trump signed the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, and it was strengthened by the Democrats in the House. There's no question about it. I consider it an improvement over NAFTA, but I support Bernie Sanders' opposition to this because there is a lot more work to do. You'll be proud to know that the United States has deployed diet nuclear weapons. That's what I would call them. There is a 5-kiloton missile that has been deployed on the USS Tennessee, a submarine. It's cruising the world now. And a 5-kiloton nuke is, let's compare it to a lawnmower in comparison to the 90 or 455 kiloton warheads on other U.S. submarine-launched ballistic missiles. In any event, the idea that we would deploy this means that we might use it, and that there could be a situation where Trump believes that a small nuclear weapon would be advisable. And that is the Pandora's box we really don't want to open, Donnie. Get a grip, will you? Les Wexner, who was implicated as the sugar daddy of Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein took the founder of Victoria's Secret, The Limited, and other national brand retailers for a big ride. And Mr. Wexler is kind of making moves to trim down his organization. He's been laying people off, and they expect that at 82 he will announce his retirement soon. And Warren Buffett, the super investor of Omaha, has sold his newspapers, 31 of them. The biggest one was the Buffalo News, $140 million in cash. And it's because about a year and a half ago, he gave an interview where he said, well, you know, the newspaper business is toast. So Warren Buffett sold his toast for $140 million. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube, and I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.